So welcome to a new episode of Discussions in Education. This is Tony Alberts again. If you notice, I'm playing with a little bit of sound at the beginning. We'll see how that goes. I got it from, let's see, where did I get it from? I got it off of SoundCloud. The guy's name is, let's see what we got. Go to artist profile. What do we got here? Oh, that's not the person I want. It's making this super easy for me to find this person's info. Nope, that's not it. I don't know why they're doing this. Okay, well, Ad Beats, capital AD Beats, and I believe the song is titled Sad Emotional Crying Hip Hop Instrumental. But it's free to use, and I'm just trying it out. So we'll see how things go. But, just trying new things out and playing with the format and see how it goes. But, like I said, I'm going to try to do these more regularly. Again, I would love to start, meeting with people and talking with them again, but on the administrative end, I just gotta find people willing to talk with me at my new school. So, building relationships and finding out who's willing to go on record to share whatever their views might be. I've thrown the idea out there to a couple people, but time's a big factor, but also I think just they're not quite sure about it. But that's the way it's always been. I think it's also a lot easier to talk somebody into it when I was just a teacher, especially other teachers. But as an administrator, I think there's a little hesitancy to say, like, what are you going to use this for, and what's the point? And honestly, again, like, the whole point is just to have conversations about education. And so I believe last time in the first episode in a long time, I mentioned that I wanted to read articles and kind of give feedback on that. And I honestly will say that was my intent. But then today, just, stuff came up that I thought was interesting and kind of should be talked about. And actually what I wanted to start discussing was kind of explain to folks were some of the changes in education regarding discipline. So again, if you don't recall, I'm an assistant principal this year, and pretty much every school that I know of, assistant principals are in charge of student discipline. So kind of climate and environment directly related to students. A lot of the times it tends to be disciplinary, but for example, sometimes you're lucky, like at my school, my principal's given me a lot of leeway to try to build positive environments and positive rewards. And so that's kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about, which is how discipline in education is changing over time and kind of where some of the conflicts are coming in and where some of the questions and issues are coming about, efficacy, and you get a lot of talk about being too lenient these days. And so just kind of taking that approach. So I don't know how it is. I could definitely, so at some point in my future, I will be a much more dedicated researching podcaster when it comes to these historical issues. But luckily for my few listeners right now, you get this is kind of what I know from hearsay version of history. So education and discipline in the United States, most people know the old school paddle approach. It's kind of one of the original ways to discipline students, the dunce cap, the paddle. Now, obviously, that also differed from school to school and situation to situation, but those are kind of the more popular stories that grandparents and parents like to share about their time in school, whether they were in Catholic schools and getting hit with rulers or sticks, or in just regular public school getting hit with a paddle, being forced to sit in the corner wearing a dunce cap. those sort of punishments for misbehavior in the classroom. And as time has evolved, that moved to what are known as detentions, which is generally sometime during lunch or after school, a period of time where students have to sit in a classroom and generally do nothing or do some sort of makeup work or possibly write letters of apology or write lines. Writing lines would be, for example, I will not spit my gum out on the ground. You write that 100 times before you're released. Suspensions also became a bigger thing. So suspensions were essentially a punishment for a more severe crime or a severe disruption. So you get in a fight at school, you bring drugs to school, you bring alcohol to school, you go home for 1, 2, 3, 4 days. The purpose of that was, I think the hope was like a hard reset. Your family would help reset you. You would be placed as a burden kind of on them, forcing them to think about what they're doing, and then they would respond, and hopefully their involvement would then change your attitude at school. But it also gave teachers a time to reset the environment in the classroom in order to kind of resolve whatever issue you might have brought in. Expulsions also. So expulsions were essentially you're no longer welcome at this school and off you go. And good luck finding another school, or you're transferred to another school in the district, or you have to go to one of the supplemental schools that are around that are tied to the county. And that is pretty much, I believe, what most people are used to with education and discipline. So if you were growing up around my time, again, I'm 34 years old, so growing up in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, that's pretty much what you knew. You knew suspensions, you knew detentions, Saturday schools. If you ever, a good example of the Saturday school, I guess, would be Breakfast Club, except for hopefully not that way. But detention, suspensions, expulsion, Saturday schools. I know a while ago they still would hold you back. So maybe your behavior was so egregious that you were failing classes that they felt like, well, maybe it's a maturity thing. You were moved up to this grade too soon. You weren't mature enough. We're going to hold you back. And that's kind of how things were. Now, with No Child Left Behind, that was George W. Bush's, the junior, not senior, not Walker Bush. Wait, Walker Bush was the older. So yeah, George W. Bush Jr.'s legacy for education was the No Child Left Behind Act, which he had started in Texas and then he spread nationwide. And one of the things that really started heavily tracking was suspension data and expulsion data, and trying to get an idea of like, what are we doing here? Are we targeting people? And one of the things a lot of the data has shown is that suspensions, expulsions, detentions even have a huge impact on minority populations, and specifically, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, well, it's racist." Yeah. So one of the big issues was actually they were seeing a lot of this in preschool and kindergarten. So again, preschool and kindergarten, for folks who don't know, kind of optional ages. I think most laws say you don't have to be in school technically until first grade, which is about 6 years old. So at 6, you have to be in school. At 5, you have the option of attending kindergarten. I know in California, there's the 4 or 5-year-olds who can go to transitional kindergarten, also known as TK. But a big part of those classes is learning how to do school. Okay, the basic assumption is you've had no schooling up to this point. Welcome to school. This is how it operates. And as such, the purpose of those years should just be, hey, this is how you operate in this environment. This is what's appropriate. This is what's not appropriate. And you're going over those rules and limitations and expectations. And what a lot of the data, as they started tracking it, as they started following it, was showing was that for the same offenses, a lot of black and brown students were getting suspended and expelled in kindergarten. And so that did raise a question of, what are we trying to do with this discipline system? And honestly, the record is if you start getting suspended and you start getting detentions in kindergarten, that negatively affects your view of school, and that kind of reinforces the negative behavior, and it kind of is a predictor of how you're ultimately going to be performing throughout school. Now, and that's obviously not 100%. None of this is ever 100%. But that was kind of one of the main predictors that people were looking at, saying, like, well, we are training these kids that their behavior, instead of teaching them how to behave differently or having that level of expectation, and we're somehow having different expectations for these black and brown students. There's more fear involved that other kids are going to be hurt or injured, or whatever the cultural background anxiety there might be, and so that those kids are being targeted unfairly. And so there was a large pushback from the government, rightfully so, on schools about how are you disciplining, what's appropriate, what's not. So, since the 2000s and on, there's been a lot of training with administrators and district level about how to appropriately deal in the classroom with students, and what you can do, what you can't do, what can be approached, what can't be approached. But, sorry, brief interruption. I was just making sure everything was okay with the baby. Anyway, so there's been a lot of training involving that. And what the big push in education has recently been is a move from these punitive punishments to what's called, I think the general term that's come around is PBIS. And that stands for Positive Behavior Intervention Systems. And so the emphasis then is on rewarding good behavior in all students, not just black and brown students, but in all students, rewarding good behavior, encouraging good behavior, focusing less on punishing the bad behavior and more on actively rewarding the good behavior, which I admit is something that has very much been lax in education. So think of it essentially as, instead of a company where you're constantly getting hounded for every document that you input incorrectly or everything that you do wrong, you're constantly being sent to HR to talk about stuff, they do what most companies actually do, which is they're rewarding the big sellers, they're encouraging the big producers, they have bonuses, they have things that you can work towards so that the positive aspects of the job are encouraged. And so that's how you should be looking at it. However, again, you've got this weird dichotomy in education, which is they haven't really explained it, approached it in a way that teachers feel supported, honestly. And as a teacher, I definitely dealt with that. Not necessarily the support aspect because I felt it, but I definitely heard from other teachers about their concerns with that sort of system. Specifically when egregious behavior incidents occurred, whether it's, students fighting, students swearing at teachers, at other students, threatening them, bringing stuff to school, whatever that might be, or vulgarity, profanity, and just, even going out so far as like taking clothes off and exposing yourself to other students. There was a general feeling, and there still is a general feeling as this transition is occurring, that those students aren't receiving any actual consequences for their actions. And so you've got this one side, the PBIS side, and honestly, there are a lot of child psychologists, school psychologists, social workers who are obviously heavily invested in that movement. And, again, to explain, a lot of it's based on the evidence of the prison system. So If you are unaware, most of the American justice system is set up to be punitive, as in, we're not going to reward you for good behavior necessarily. We are going to constantly punish you for your bad behavior, for your infractions. And if you are unaware, America has one of the highest ratio of people, and even honestly just the number of people in prison in America is significantly higher than pretty much every other country in the world. Now, admittedly, people like, so, well, they just kill them in other countries. Yeah, but not in the industrialized countries. They don't, like, if you do something wrong in Germany, they don't just kill you. That's not how that works there. And that's who we should be comparing ourselves to, the larger industrial-sized companies. If you start comparing yourself to Somalia, a country that hasn't had a working government in quite a while, mainly due to our actions within that country, that we don't want to compare ourselves to a country that has no government. So anyway, a lot of the reasons for the PBIS push, the positive behavior push, is because they're trying to do more of a complete communal psychology based on their research movement in student discipline to reduce the amount of negative behavior in schools, while also, again, teaching, reinforcing, and expecting the good behaviors, the positive behaviors. And again, that is all in the belief that schools previously have been well known as a school to prison pipeline, as in we discipline students in school, and if you've been disciplined with a suspension, expulsion, etc. in school, the likelihood that you end up in prison or serving some sort of jail time at some point in your life significantly increases. All right, we're not talking about like, oh, you got that one suspension for that one thing you do, but generally, even as an admin now, I can say that, the folks who get suspensions tend to be repeat offenders. Suspensions don't do anything to change that behavior. Okay, that is blatantly clear. All right, there are the folks who accidentally do something or make one poor choice, who have very supportive families, and a suspension is something that will change them. Okay, because that's a sudden, abrupt removal from a situation that tells them that their actions were wrong, and so them and their families respond appropriately. That fixes the situation. In those situations, that quick, punitive, hey, what are you doing? Think about your actions. That's something that not only are they capable of doing, those students, but also their families are capable of supporting them. Those happen. Okay, so in those instances, that maybe they got a little too crazy in a teacher's classroom, and this is a reminder that no, it doesn't matter the teacher, you have to be respectful in the room. Okay, great. They'll work that out. The rest of the year will go fine. Right? But generally, those aren't the kids who are getting suspended. Okay? The kids who get suspended usually have either stuff going on at home, stuff going on socially. It's never, or it's very rarely a kid with, all support systems at home or around them. And they tend to repeat. Honestly, they tend to repeat. And so for psychologists, social workers, admin, and, honestly, a lot of teachers. A lot of teachers have spearheaded PBIS at their schools. The other big spearhead is also known as restorative justice circles, and I've talked about those before, ways of building community and encouraging positive behavior and discussing things. The big spearhead, again, is the fact that the punitive system has not worked, and will not work. We can keep doing it until we're blue in the face, but that system will not work. But again, on the other side, the pushback on PBIS is that you are seeing a fear on the behalf of teachers who see that students who have these extreme behaviors. So again, I'm not talking about, this kid's talking back in class. And yes, you do get those teachers, but that's not what teachers are talking about. They're talking about a student who consistently steals from other students, or a student who is well known for jumping kids after school, or a student who's constantly profane, or, like a male student who always runs into the girls' locker room, or a girl student who always runs to the boys. Like those sort of extreme situations where, PBIS is going to call for a setup of a behavior system in which their good behavior is rewarded and the negative behavior is somewhat glossed over, in the hopes that just encouraging the good behavior will be what changes the situation. And so a lot of teachers see that and they feel unsupported. Plain and simple. They don't feel safe in their own classrooms. They don't feel that their own decisions as educators are being respected. And sometimes they're right, and sometimes there's a very good reason. But that is their honest concern, is that fear that, okay, we're setting up these systems, we're just rewarding. When will the kids learn that real life has actual consequences? And so right now, that's kind of the struggle that's going on in education as PBIS moves forward, as restorative justice moves forward. You have schools attempting to build these systems, and honestly, it's not perfect. They're always a work in progress. It's always difficult. Communication here, as you're building the systems, is key. You need to keep teachers informed. They need to feel like, well, what's happening is happening. If they feel that you are also stuck, I think communicating that you're working on it, but communicating that you are stuck is also important in this. And so I guess the reason I want to bring this up is just because how interesting the dynamic is. Like, for myself, I am torn. And I am torn because, knowing the history, I know that a more positive, my personal approach is the restorative justice approach. So establishing community, building discussion, talking, attempting to get kids invested in school in that way. But, what we're contending with also in education these days is something that's that we didn't have to worry about as much back in the day. And that's obviously the social media aspect. All right. So something that, so you have the positive behavior, you have the positive behavior system that's supposed to reward positive behavior. You have the punitive, which punishes the bad behavior, the old style. You have systems that are a combination of it. And then you have social media. And quite honestly, for a lot of teenagers and elementary school kids and high schoolers, social media is kind of the opposite of PBIS a lot of the time. Just being very blunt about this, it tends to be, for kids, a negative behavior intervention system. As in, they can they can do something at school, possibly film themselves, maybe not. Maybe they just go home and they make a film about it. A short 15-second video for Instagram or Snapchat. That's going to get them positive fame. They can talk about like, oh, well, this teacher today was doing this, and I told her, F you. and that's going to get a bunch of likes from kids, from their peers. Right? And honestly, a lot of that positive behavior, or not a lot of that positive behavior, but a lot of that that feedback there is worth more to them than the feedback at school from an adult. Because, these days in education, again, stuff I've talked about before, revolving administrators, revolving teachers, that constant movement on the adult part, and in their personal lives, a constant movement of adult figures has led them to trust less in the adults in their lives and trust more in the kids who have been there. They've been with this kid since kindergarten, and their opinion counts more than this adult they're meeting for the first time, their 7th grade year or 8th grade year. That's just the way that works. That's their family versus their chosen family versus this new stranger. And so I think education really has to figure out how to balance that PBIS and that NBIS, that negative behavior intervention system. It's a rough one. I don't have the answers there. Like I said, I prefer the restorative justice approach. One, because it's optional. I mean, that is the thing with PBIS. PBIS is still a system largely imposed on kids. And it's imposed because, the feeling is they don't know how to engage, and so that we're going to impose this system so that they can learn the appropriate ways to improve. Again, encouraging those positive behaviors as opposed to the old system of punitive. But what I've always appreciated about the restorative approach is, while PBIS does have check-ins and discussion built into it to kind of discuss behaviors and talk about them, I think restorative justice is focused much more on building a community that clearly holds people accountable for their actions and clearly discusses, approaches, and wrestles with problems together as a larger group. PBIS tends to be more adult-student sort of conversations, at least from my experience. I don't know if they're meant to be run differently, but that's kind of what I've seen. And so I think in this instance, a lot of time there's going to be that agree to disagree situation. But I will say legally, obviously schools are on a much weaker footing than they used to be. Right? With all the data that's been showing up and with all the proof of profiling, students of color, students new to the United States, a lot of stuff. And honestly, even though that does not happen as much anymore, the fact is that any instance that it does happen becomes headline news in that state. And because of social media, all the kids read it. We might think kids don't read. Oh, okay. We might correctly think that kids don't read articles, but they certainly have taken to reading headlines. All right, and those get passed around super fast, especially when it's something crazy. And so there is that antagonism that's kind of there. But for me personally, I mean, I'm definitely a root of the problem sort of guy, which is, what I kind of talked about in the last episode during the restorative justice circle when I was talking with kids. And wait, did I? Oh, no, I'm sorry. My brain's all lost. So, sorry, since the last podcast, I ran a restorative justice circle with a bunch of students. During it, I asked them 2 questions. The first question was, what are you good at? Just one thing, doesn't matter. And again, my circle is mixed. So it has high students, academically high students, socially high students, socially low students, academically low students, a little bit of everything. But the socially low kids, even them, they are leaders on campus. As in, so for the groups of kids that they hang out with, folks look up to them. Folks respect them to some extent. So I met with them. I'm asking all of them, just, again, let's go around the circle. What's one thing you're good at? And if you've never been part of a restorative justice circle, since was the one running it, and I'm running the first kind of set, I shared first. I said, one of the things I'm good at is liking to learn stuff. I love learning new things, get bored pretty easy, and so learning something new and struggling, that's exciting to me. And I passed it on. And 6th grade boy, and he's like, I'm not good at anything. Video games, art, hanging out with friends, making people laugh. You got nope, I'm not good at anything. And this is a kid who does like to participate. And going around that circle, so we have about 18, 19 kids in that circle. About half of them, and split. Some of the academically high, some of the academically low, socially high, socially low, pretty even split even here. Most of them said nothing. They could not think of something that they felt confident enough to say that I'm good at it. You know, there's some things that they didn't quite suck at, was their feeling, but there was nothing that they felt good about. And that depressed me. That answer depressed me. I was like, what are you talking about? How can you have nothing that you feel good at? I was like, even at your age, I had a video game that I was like, I'm not great at this video game, but I'm pretty good at this video game. You know, or I'm really good at reading books or something. Like, I'm good at finding a new book that I want to read. Whatever it might be. But just so many kids saying they weren't good at anything. You know, as an admin, somebody who's been in education for 8 years, that freaked me out. Because for me, that tells me about schools. Okay, and I'm not calling out my school district. I'm saying that this is part of the school system right now. And a big part of the school system is teaching a lot of kids that they're not worth shit unless they're producing what we want. And to some extent, you know, in America and the world, that is right. But I think at 12 and 13, giving them that feeling and having it so deeply embedded in them, where it's not like I don't want to participate and I'm not going to say anything, but the response is just nothing. No, like, I got nothing. And, you know, it's not a look of shame in their face. It's just a look of acceptance. That kind of breaks you a little. I don't know. I mean, maybe not. But for me, that broke me a little. That was a little rough to hear. And so, you know, we go through the circle, we hear, and, you know, I got some responses like, I'm just good at math. I know that. And I appreciated that. I was like, great. That's awesome. I'm glad you know that about yourself. That's a wonderful thing. And so then we get to the next question. So, you know, I had one plan, but I decided to change it up because I was like, okay. You know, I kind of put you guys on the spot accidentally. I thought there would be more positive answers, or at least you guys would have more stuff. So here's a fun one. I mean, and I told him, I was like, if you ever get to a job, one of the things you tend to bond over, you know, just being real about it, is you complain about stuff. So what's one thing that you guys dislike about school, or you dislike about class? Like, maybe it's a specific class, maybe it's school in general. And again, I started it. And I said, my big issue with school is the fact that it clearly gives a large number of you in here feeling that you're not worth anything and that you have nothing of value. And I think that does a disservice to the fact that you guys are very knowledgeable about the world in real life. And so I guess my issue with school is that I don't feel it correctly addresses the lives that you guys are living, and so it's not relevant. And I had 4 or 5 kids echo that. You know, the responses of this one were a lot more varied. Some of them were just like, I just don't like homework. Fair enough. I didn't like homework either. Like, I can't argue with that one. But as it went around, definitely more varied answers here, a little more lighthearted, and we kind of were able to get back to it. One student who was a student that everybody's like, oh my God, they're driving me crazy. But that student said, I don't like the fact that all the textbooks are written by white men. I was like, okay. Like, you know, to be fair, most of the textbooks we have aren't written by just white men. It's actually women and people of color. And anyway, but I absolutely understand. Actually, he might be right about the history textbook, and that might have been his specific emphasis, because that history textbook's pretty old, so quite possible. But, you know, it was one of those funny moments where I was like, well, wow, like, that was very insightful. I don't know if you personally feel that, if that's something you've heard from others. Either way, I'm impressed that was the message he came up with for the circle. And that's why I actually really like these circles, is that I learn about kids' ways of thinking, and I learn about their approach to life, and in ways that you're not going to see in the standard classroom, and in ways that you're not going to see even outside when they're interacting with their peers. But again, like how all this started was me talking about root causes. And for me, I feel that we have a very, very difficult time in education right now, but also a lot of opportunity. And it's really weird, especially here in California. For those of you out there who haven't really been looking at the new standards, the Common Core standards, or maybe all you've seen are the internet memes about it, but a large push in the Common Core standards is less content and more skill-based. And I know, like, a lot of people are like, oh, but you need to know facts. Yes, you do need to know facts, but not really. I think it's more important these days to be able to identify facts and vet whether a fact is more objectively true than another fact. And you might say, like, how can you have two facts? Okay, sorry, you are correct. So looking at two ideas and determining whether one is an opinion and one is a fact, or are they both opinions, or are they both facts, looking at different aspects of the same issue, determining their value and determining which one is the best use for whatever purpose you have at that moment. So a lot of stuff is skill based now. And I don't feel that educators right now yet feel comfortable to take advantage of that. I don't feel a lot of admin are at a point where they really understand how that can be taken advantage of. I don't feel a lot of districts see that aspect yet either. I think part of the reason that educators aren't comfortable with this, and I'm sorry if there's a weird break there. Again, at home recording, had to go check on the child. But during No Child Left Behind, a big part of education became something known as scripted curriculum, in which teachers were literally given every aspect of their curriculum in an attempt to hope that this will meet the demands of the situation such that these children will all be educated the same. And sometimes scripted curriculums work, and a lot of the time, for me personally, as a teacher teaching it, I couldn't do it. I think I got into teaching just at the right time as the move was being made from that to project-based learning, where you do a lot more projects and you publish them and you make something big and consider it and talk about it. That's how I was educated growing up. Definitely a lot of big ideas, unanswerable questions talked about growing up, whether it was at home or at school, which I liked. And I think most kids kind of like that sort of stuff, that real life consideration. But we have a couple generations of teachers trained to be scripted teachers. And then now being told, now you have to step out of that box. And we want you to create your curriculum and we want you to be a big part of it. But with the new Common Core standards, the first demand a lot of teachers are having is like, what's my curriculum? Give it to me. Let me teach that. Which is unfortunate. You know, I think they definitely lost an opportunity there. And, creating your own curriculum takes time. But it's so much more enjoyable to actually teach. Like 100 times more enjoyable when you've built something that's not based just on a textbook. That's not based on this week you're doing this and this week you're doing that. It's an interesting thing being on the admin side, but it's also interesting in that, like last year as a history teacher, knowing that the history standards were incredibly fluid, or they had come out, but there's no testing happening. There's nothing there. A lot of it was skill-based considerations for history. I felt so free. I could do whatever I want. I spent, 6 weeks on immigration. I spent 6 weeks talking about the Bill of Rights. There were so many things that I was allowed to do, and people were like, well, you didn't get through U.S. history. You didn't even get to the Civil War. I'm like, who cares? I was like, we had deep, interesting conversations. They were able to create interesting projects. That's what I liked. If I can get one kid interested in history because of that, I think that's way more important than them having all of those facts, because those facts they can look up online. Those facts are out there. They're easy to find. Knowing what the right website is, that's important. So that's one thing we definitely stressed. But trying to learn how to express yourself online, trying to consider history in a new way so that it applied to modern day problems was a big part of my class. And a big part of the consideration that I wanted them to have when they were considering these old ideas and then looking at society today. That was a big part of it. And even with the fluidity of science these days, I mean, there's so much that teachers could be choosing to do and creating, but there's still that ever-present draw, like, I have to get through the curriculum. That constant worry about the tests. And that test worry is always going to be there, because that's obviously what you're going to get harassed about. That's what No Child Left Behind taught administrators and teachers. And then them as trainers, as mentors, they've passed that fear and tension on to the next generation, and then the next generation of educators. And I think that fear, that tension there, that scripted curriculum practice, I think that's also what's driven a lot of people who get into education originally out of it. You know, we talk about teacher retention. That's a huge thing. And in this case, teacher retention, I feel, is really tied strongly to student retention. It's like, if we're losing a lot of teachers within the first 5 years because of the environment that's within schools, how can you blame kids for going through school for 5 years and then not wanting to engage in it, not wanting to be a part of it? And you're obviously always going to get a large chunk that are just obedient. That's what happens. Welcome to any group. You get a large chunk that just kind of follow the rules, keep their heads down, maybe some do their own thing, but they stay out of the limelight. You get those ones who achieve in the system because the system's built for them. And that doesn't matter where you are, and that doesn't matter about the color of your skin or what the systems can be built for you. That's just the way it is. And then you're going to get those who the system doesn't work for. And in a job, those folks get fired. You know, in a school, those folks get suspended and expelled. And all of it, I mean, again, to teachers, and those folks leave, all right? Or they're forced to leave. The system doesn't work for them, or maybe their approach doesn't work. Who knows? I mean, there's a lot of reasons for a teacher leaving. But I think until we address those fundamental issues in education, that fundamental lack of relevance in most kids' lives that they can see every day online, it's not hidden anymore. Like, that fundamental lack of, I guess, originality. And some I'm not saying, but I'm saying in the system itself, it's built to withstand originality. And you still get teachers who come and create something original and something amazing. And those are those awesome teachers. That's why I became an admin. I want to support those awesome teachers in being able to be original. All right? I want to be that buffer between them and the district or whoever might be out there who wants to stamp down that originality. Especially if that originality, I mean, kids love that. You know, kids like when you're genuine. They're like everyone else. Kids, surprisingly, are human. And the more genuine of a person you are in your interactions with them, the more they respect that. Yeah, I have folks say, like, oh, and again, this used to be back in the day in the classroom too. This kid's terrible, this kid does this, blah, 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 blah. How do you deal with him or her? And I say, they don't act like that in my classroom. Or, sometimes they do. I'll say, oh, yeah, whenever they do that, I pull them aside and have a talk with them, and then they're fine. Or here are the strategies they and I worked out in order to cope with the situation. So, I mean, there's so many things where, very rarely did I send folks away. Very rarely did I, freak out. I'm not saying I didn't. People are like, oh, were you amazing? No, God, I was not perfect. I definitely sent kids away. I definitely freaked out. But I apologized. That's definitely something I rarely saw teachers do growing up. Like, I can't remember at any point in my teaching or my student profession until college where a teacher apologized for something just off the cuff that shouldn't have happened. And I felt like every other week or so in my class, my first year, I was apologizing. And not in a weak way. I wasn't like, oh, kids, I'm sorry. Don't hurt me. Don't get angry. But in a way that's truthful. It's like, oh, doing this for the first time, guys. That did not work. Sorry about that. Only human. How can we fix this to make sure it doesn't happen again? In the way you should be approaching problems. And honestly, I feel like that change in education, if we could make education again more original, more authentic, more genuine, more based on the individual teacher's personality, we're going to solve so many more issues than just emphasizing PBIS and restorative justice or even punitive measures. And honestly, the best behavior system is a combination of all three of those systems. Like, you should start with PBIS and restorative justice, in which community discussions are had and community is built, and positive behavior is encouraged and emphasized and influenced. But there are still, despite all of those things, kids who are not going to engage in those systems. And whether that's because their system, their past is so traumatic that there is no trust there. And that's a problem with PBIS and restorative justice, is that those are heavily trust-based. You need to have someone who can engage in trust. But sometimes people are just so hurt by it. Or developmentally, they're not there. They don't understand what engagement in that system means. Now, PBIS, it's fine for little kids. That makes sense. Rewarding them for their good behavior. And you're just emphasizing that. That's a good way to get in the system. But, as you get older, especially in middle school, there are times where kids make decisions that there need to be a real life consequence for that they experience, because they're getting so close to adulthood. And I'm going to be very honest, especially poor kids or brown and black kids. They need that line in school where maybe the greatest aspect of it is a suspension, so that they learn those boundaries and that those actions aren't allowed. Because what I've also seen in my time in education is those kids not getting those boundaries. Educators letting actions and attitudes and situations pass by, and those kids ending up in really bad places because no one had introduced them to that initial, hey, don't go past this line is the bad line, and not sitting and having that talk with them. I mean, education really is a juggling act, especially student discipline. Let me be clear about a couple of things. You will never discipline a student in a way that everyone's satisfied. Whether it's the student, whether it's the family, whether it's other admins, whether it's the district, whether it's the teachers, whether it's other students. There's always going to be someone with a different opinion. I feel as an admin, my approach is I'm going to explain all the reasoning behind my action so that even if you don't agree with it, you at least understand it. Anyway, I hope you guys learned something about the different types of behavior systems. I totally rambled still. I don't know how I want to approach this podcast. Again, my preference, my love is when I've got a friend here to talk with or a colleague. I just obviously enjoy conversations more, but I still am trying to, again, talking about learning, trying to force myself to learn how to do this more and produce something, a discussion that's not that's tied to my passion. Like, I am passionate about education. It's something I love. It's definitely the right choice of career for me, but that's not in my current job. You know, I don't mind referencing stuff, but obviously I have to keep it vague. You know, I don't want to call people out. That's not what I'm here about. I'm here to point out, like, hey, just so you guys know, so-and-so is an awesome teacher, or so-and-so is a terrible teacher. Actually, you know what? I think I will call out awesome teachers when I run into them. And I've run into a lot. I guess I could be calling out people for days right now. But again, that's not the purpose. But just realize that if sometimes you're like, what the hell is he talking about? Like, he's being so vague and obtuse that I have no idea what's going on. Like, you can definitely, like, I will work on that as well. But again, I these ones are more just kind of stream of consciousness about a specific topic. I will at some point talk about articles and books. Honestly, the book I'm reading right now is the one that my district superintendent handed out. And actually, one of the guys on Instagram I saw, Twitter, he's reading it as well. It's called The Power of Moments. It's a private industry book, but I've talked about it. I know I talked about that one in the last podcast, but that one's actually really good. I like it. It's got really interesting ideas. But actually, so again, my mind jumping everywhere, stream of consciousness. I swear I'm not on anything right now. One of the things I was thinking about next year was trying to build a small team of teachers who would be the experimenters. Because I'm seeing a lot of interest in projects and stuff like that at school and engineering design process. But a big component of project-based learning is actually a very public showing, and hopefully a communally useful project as well. So something that helps the community, but also, or is a part of the community, addresses an issue in the community, but then is also evaluated by more than just the teacher or students in the class, but is evaluated by the school, evaluated by multiple schools or the district, or even just community members. So that's something that I want to try working with some teachers at my school next year. Having done the Mars Colony at my previous school at Davis, I really enjoyed that. The capstone project. We did talk about how we would like to alter it in the future. One of the ideas was focusing it more on an actual community project, or focusing it on, like, having the teams focus on different things, but still doing the end of year presentation where they got that feedback and that feeling of presenting in front of others, and just that being kind of held accountable. I really like that. I thought that was one way to make it relevant to kids, is making their work public. Whether or not in a real sense it's actually relevant, because obviously, like, you know, they're not taking their Mars. I mean, someday they might take their Mars rover ideas somewhere, but I don't know. That's just something I've been kicking around about, dealing with that kind of issue that I brought up. So if there's any pressing issues you guys want addressed in education, feel free to email me. Again, the email tied to this account is mr.albertsp.d@gmail.com. You can email me questions about education. You can email me anything. You can just say, hey, whatever. Or if there's some, like, egregious issue in my podcasting, like, hey, you keep saying and it's driving me insane, I really am working on that. Or maybe my stream of consciousness is way too difficult to follow. Any feedback is great. Maybe not just random insults. I like to avoid that, but anything you got, pass my way. All right, you guys. I love everybody out there. Hope you all doing well. I'm gonna try to exit with some of this music. I don't know where it's gonna play in the song. So, again, this was found on SoundCloud. The title of it again was "Sad, Emotional, Crying Hip Hop Instrumental," which is odd because it's not very sad or cryy, but I think it should be playing now.